Hello there. This is Jen T. Grace, founder and CEO of Publish Your Purpose. And I am here with the three-time author, Ellen Patnaude, to talk about her new book, You're Not Doing It Right. Ellen, how are you?
I'm doing just fine, Jen. How are you?
I am doing fantastic. And I'm even better now that I'm holding two of your books, not just one of your books. So we'll start with your new book. So You're Not Doing It Right. Loving my mother through an unpredictable caregiving journey. Shall we start there, Ellen? Because this book just came out. You just had your a book launch party.
Yep.
I feel like we could go in 100 directions, but I'm curious if you want to just kind of speak to why you wrote this book, and then I have a couple of follow-up questions.
Sure. So I wrote this book because I was a reluctant caregiver. My mother developed dementia in 2016. Well, we noticed in 2016. And because her mother had had Alzheimer's, we all made a huge assumption that she would also have Alzheimer's. And for my grandmother, that was a 20+ year journey and a slow, steady decline over time. About a year into my mother's dementia, we realized we were not dealing with Alzheimer's. It was something very different. There was a lot of lucidity. She was hallucinating a lot of the time. It didn't behave at all like my grandmother's Alzheimer's had. And so we ultimately got a diagnosis for her in 2018 of Lewy dementia. And throughout that period of time, and then she eventually passed away at the end of 2020. So her run with it was very, very short, even by Lewy body dementia standards. And I just felt like we could not get out from behind the 8 ball the entire time. We didn't know what we were doing. I was resentful going into my caregiving experience. I had a difficult relationship with my mother going in, and I felt this enormous shame narrative hanging over me for much of that time about the ways in which society told me I ought to feel as a caregiver, and I ought to be handling the situation. And of course, as women, we receive these messages that we ought to be super women and able to handle anything that comes our way and just take it in stride and keep smiling. So I was running a business. I was with my wife running a small hobby farm, raising kids, and taking care of my parents who were living in the carriage house next door. And it proved to be overwhelming much of the time. After she passed away, I grieved very, very hard for a couple of years because of the complicated relationship and a lot of unresolved things. And I realized at the end of those 2 years that I needed to figure out a way to process this experience and get it out of my body. And so I decided I was going to write a book about it. And so entering the Getting Started for Authors program, I wrote the story. And it ended up being the story I needed to read during the time I was going through this, because so many stories about caregiving reflect what I think is a polished, cleaned up version of what caregiving looks like, because we make assumptions about what is acceptable for us to say or feel or think or do as caregivers. And we make assumptions about ourselves. We make assumptions about the process and the experience. And I needed to read a story that told me there was nothing wrong with me because I was struggling and because I was resentful and because I couldn't figure out how to do anything right, it felt like, on a lot of days. And of course, my mother told me that often, which is where this name of the book comes from. So I wrote it because I needed to get it out of my system. And I wanted to help other caregivers who I've encountered that are going through equally difficult situations, who also feel that shame narrative hanging over them about we make these rules about what's okay to say or think or feel or do, and they're bullshit. So I wanted to write a story that gave people permission to lean into that a little bit and just be honest with themselves about what they're going through and what they need, and get rid of that shame narrative, because it's not helpful.
Mm-hmm. There's so many things I could ask you. My mind right now is going to the courage that it takes from your standpoint as an author to say, I'm not going to write a memoir about this the same way everyone else writes this type of memoir, right? Because there are a lot of memoirs that have caregiving journeys included in them. Did you struggle? Because it's kind of like a two-part thing, because you do have your other book, which is, I will show up as well, I Thought You Knew, Confessions of a Chronic Assumer. And you talk all about assumptions in this book. And so it's clear that there's the through line of assumptions here and assumptions here. So it seems like, yeah, of course, like your work in the world is speaking about assumptions and helping companies and individuals figure out how to like not let assumptions interfere with their lives, their jobs, whatever it may be. But at the same time, I feel like it must have, did you have a moment of like imposter syndrome or doubt, or like, why do I think I can be the one that can write a book about caregiving that is completely opposite to everything else that exists out there? Like, what was your battle struggle, if there were one, in wrestling with that? Because I feel like that's what my mind immediately went to.
I mean, you could talk to the members of that Getting Started for Authors cohort who shepherded me through the process and accompanied me through the process. I lived with imposter syndrome right up through the publication date of this book, from start to finish. When I first came up with the idea that maybe I wanted to write about this, I dismissed it as valid. And I came to that first session and said, I had two different ideas of what I could write about. And I talked about both ideas, one of which was this book. And the immediate response from everyone in the group was, oh, that's the book you need to write. Mm-hmm. And I think, I mean, my life story is a living example of sort of flying in the face of convention in a lot of ways. I've always been the person who speaks up and says, nah, I'm going to call bullshit on that. That's not reality. That's not accurate. We're not being honest here. I don't know. It's just sort of how I don't know why, but it's how I've walked through life to a large extent. I've owned my own business for 19 years now. Being self-employed lends itself to, walking with a little more authenticity through it, I think, because I'm my own boss. So, but that doesn't mean that I don't suffer from the imposter syndrome. I wrote an email to all of my early readers right before the launch, telling them how petrified I was. I wrote a newsletter to my newsletter subscribers talking about how petrified I was of the judgment that I am afraid could come my way, because I did not write a delicate story about some long goodbye. I wrote a nightmare, hellish roller coaster tale, because that is what we lived. And the response that I've gotten from people so far has been extremely helpful and validating, because so many people are raising their hands saying, me too. I didn't go through what you went through, but I went through something similar enough that this resonates so deeply with me. So thank you for being honest. Thank you for telling the truth. Thank you for giving voice to these things I was too ashamed to give voice to myself, because I thought I wasn't supposed to, right? So I've received so much validation along the way from the writing cohort, from my early readers, from my family and friends who have supported me through this journey, that has helped. But I don't think I set out with the intention of writing a story that was unlike anyone else's. I think I set out with the intention of getting my own experience out of my body and having a way to process it, which I do through speaking and writing. And so I needed to have the writing experience to just process my own grief and what I went through. And at the end of it, what I realized is, I kind of wrote the story that I wish I could have read during that time, because it would have made me feel less like a piece of shit and less like failure in the midst of a really terrible, difficult experience for anyone to navigate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like it's so often the case, right, where people are writing the book that they wish they themselves had. And I feel like your book is going to do so many good things in the world because it's not that soft, fluffy BS, let's make everything look rosy when the reality is anything but. So I love that. And that is also incredibly fitting of your personality, where you are not a sugarcoater, a fluffer of things. You are very kind of direct, which I personally appreciate. So I'm curious because the book's only been out for a little bit. You've just had a launch party. Has anyone specifically, aside from your early readers, already kind of like read it and said something to you that you're like, oh my God, like done. Like I did what I came to do.
Yes. Yeah. So I got a note from a longtime friend of my mom, of my parents, another couple that my parents were friends with for 40 years. I grew up with their kids. And she came to the launch party and bought a copy of the book and sent me a note a couple of days later to say that she was almost done with the book and that she just could not believe what we'd gone through, that she was so incredibly glad to know more about what had happened, that her heart just hurt for us because she knew my mom. Sorry. Because she knew mom and she didn't know. She didn't know what we'd gone through because we didn't talk about it because we didn't think we were supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
And she said she particularly appreciated at the end of every chapter, there's a section that's called Looking Back Now, where I take my current day self and reflect back now with some time and space between the experience. I can look back now with a different set of eyes to understand a little bit more about what my mom must have been going through, why she reacted the way that she did, what I was going through. Of course, that would have been my reaction. And so I share some reflections, and then I also give a few pieces of what I would say are sort of like gentle advice of just, take better care of yourself, keep a journal. Here's the kinds of questions you might need to ask if you're at this stage. Here's another perspective to keep in mind if this is where you are right now. It's by no means meant to be a book that's technically expert, right? It's very much a memoir, but I'm me, so I'm trying to offer some kind of guidance and some help for people reading who might be going through something difficult. And she said that for her was such an incredibly important part of reading it because she can see the ways in which her own children will need to have something like that if she and or her husband are affected. And she said she just thanked me and said that it was an incredible story to read and that she was so proud of me for putting it out there.
Wow.
So
I feel like I'm sure that was incredibly unexpected, right? Like
completely
of all people. Wow. And to just know you, to know them, to know like the dynamics and the relationships. I feel like that's so powerful. So that's like one extreme where it's like the unexpected, but also someone that's like close and like knows the players. Have you had anyone like people who don't know you or just kind of randomly reached out yet that may have some kind of impact with this?
So I've had a few people join my mailing list and purchase the book off of my website that I don't know. Nice. People that I do know have been very generous in sharing on social media about the book, about its impact on them. And that has caused a few people that I don't know to connect with me and pick up the book, but I haven't heard feedback from them as of yet.
Well, this is my call to action then. People should provide feedback and reviews.
Yes,
and reviews.
absolutely.
I feel like there's not enough reviews make such a big difference, and they're so easy to write quickly
Yeah.
for an author and for a book that you know, obviously, you know, we want good reviews, but honest reviews,
Right.
right? Like, so even if you didn't like it for some reason, just leave an honest review, because it makes a difference.
Absolutely.
You know, I'm what thinking about people who might be watching this, hearing your book, hearing about it, hearing about your story and experience. What are your plans, if you will, for kind of just maybe not plans? My idea is that if someone's watching this and they have someone in their life who is struggling and they're in this situation right now, this is like a perfect book to provide to them. But then beyond that, I would imagine that there's probably situations in healthcare settings, facilities, things like that, where this book would be such a value add for people to be able to just kind of hand to somebody. Maybe it's the family members of someone who's recently diagnosed. You know, like what's your kind of thoughts or visions or hopes, I guess, around just kind of spreading this message? Because it's a memoir, and it's about you, and it's about your mom, and it's about your family. But at the end of the day, like, it's not about you, right? Like, it's about helping other people feel seen. So I'm curious what your hopes are around that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I am hopeful that there will be opportunities to connect with healthcare agencies. I've actually had two people that are running like assisted living facilities or programs for memory care that reach out to me to connect, to have conversations about having me speak to the families as a way to just offer another perspective and support, to give permission. I've had a couple of people ask me if I would ever consider creating a model for, I don't want to say necessarily a support group as much as like almost like coaching for caregivers, something where people can, you know, learn to recognize that whatever it is that they're feeling and experiencing during this is valid. The goal is not to try to get rid of those feelings or push them aside. The goal is to understand them and process them, and then use them in a way that can be helpful to your goals, in terms of what you want for your loved one and what you want for yourself in this experience. So there's all kinds of ideas floating around that could come to fruition. I would love to do more speaking to groups. I would love to talk to doctors, nurses, and the medical community, because a few stories in the book talk about our less than ideal, to put it very mildly, experiences with healthcare providers who, while they were clinically very accurate, their bedside manner was unacceptable and atrocious. And the messages were delivered in ways that were very harmful, not only to me as a caregiver, but to my mother. And so just raising the awareness of the medical community around the need to see not only patients as people, but their families as well, and take those stories into consideration as a way to help them improve their own healthcare delivery. So I would love to, I feel pretty passionate about reaching the medical community as well as reaching caregiver families. You know, the advice that exists out there for the most part right now is just to be more patient, or redirect, or, you know, it's like, you know what, we all know we need to be more patient, right? But how the hell do you do that in the middle of everything being on fire with this person you've historically got an already difficult relationship with, who's throwing something at you? Being more patient isn't particularly helpful advice in the midst of that. So how do we create better solutions? How do we create better ways for people to actually deal with what's in front of them in a way that's helpful for everyone? So I would love to get in front of more group that, now I'm going to be spending some energy to see if I can be of service for those audiences.
Yeah, it's why I was asking, because I feel like there's such a broadness to this, because there's so many people who are caregiving in some form or fashion, And I think there are so many broken pieces of these larger systems. And we've had many conversations trying to figure out, like, how do we get this into the hands of the right people? So I'm glad that you were able to express that, because I think if someone's listening to this, they might say, oh, well, I didn't think of that. I know someone who, insert the blank here. And so it can kind of help this become a movement and gain ground, because I feel like it's just something, unfortunately, I think caregiving, there's such a universalness to the struggle, and you are just writing about it in the realist way possible, which I think is probably both horrifying and satisfying, depending on the reader, right? Because like you're really just hitting people with the truth, which is what I think is really required, and what you've been kind of expressing.
There is a trigger warning at the beginning of the book because it's true. It is, there's people have PTSD from these experiences that they go through, especially because they feel like they're not supposed to talk about it. They're not supposed to feel some kind of way. And so there's a trigger warning at the beginning that says, what there are stories about death and mother-daughter conflict, and there's a lot of cussing, and there's vivid descriptions of hallucinations, and that people need to take care of themselves as they read the stories. And I've had several people give me that feedback, from the early readers to the current ones, which is that they have to put it down and walk away, especially if they knew my mother or know me, because it's so incredibly intimate and real and raw. And so they have to put it down and walk away because it's hard. I've had other people tell me they have to put it down and walk away because it brings all of their own experience rushing back, and that it's just something they haven't fully processed yet. So it isn't your typical caregiving book. I am trying to tell people that, not as a way to just, market myself differently, but also just to in a very real way, make sure that people understand what they're getting into when they pick up this book. I hope it's a helpful and compelling story, but I also know that it's very raw, and for some people that will be very difficult to read.
Yeah, I have not read it in its entirety. I've obviously seen lots of chunks and pieces and parts over time, but I feel like I have to be in the right mental health space in order to pick it up. Like, I already know that about myself, so I'm like, I will ease into her as my mental health feels okay to do so. Yeah. Well, one thing I want to bring up that's kind of pivoting a little bit is, because again, you're not doing it right. It's such a great title because it says everything, right? Like, I think it says everything. And yet at the beginning, we're saying, like, there's this through line of assumptions. There's all these assumptions of what you should be doing, shouldn't be doing, this, that, and the other. And so going back to your first book, which I thought you knew, Confessions of a Chronic Assumer, which I have always loved your title. You now have a podcast that is called Confessions of a Chronic Assumer. So I am curious if you could indulge us and give us like a little glimpse, because it's just about to launch. And I would imagine it's probably weaving in a blend of all of these things that we're talking about today.
It is. So, I sort of stumbled on this hot topic of assumptions a few years ago during the pandemic, because I noticed people making wild assumptions about one another as everyone started working remotely. So the teams and leader was supporting, I just was astonished by some of the things coming out of their mouths about one another. And when I started thinking about it and looking at my own experiences more closely, I realized I had a lifetime of experience with making assumptions myself and getting this wrong. So I have come to firmly believe I have yet to have this debunked by anyone. I welcome anyone to reach out to me if they've got an example of this not being the case. I posit that assumptions are the root cause of every single kind of breakdown in communication. There is an assumption at root of what causes communication to break down. And that applies to families, it applies to working relationships, it applies to friends, it applies to like literally every type of communication that we get ourselves into. It also applies to, like what I was talking about before, assumptions about what we think we have permission to do or say or think or even feel, right? The shame narrative around caregiving comes from assumptions about how we're allowed to feel about this experience that we're going through and what we're allowed to say about this experience that we're going through. I'm a member of a couple of groups on Facebook for caregivers with people through dementia, and I am not surprised by, but saddened by the number of people who post anonymously in that group when they're talking about just their feelings of frustration, resentment. When they need to unburden themselves of all those feelings, they do it anonymously because they're afraid of the attacks. And even anonymous posts get those comments. You should be grateful to be in this position. I'm sorry. F you. You don't get to tell me how I should be feeling in this moment. So I decided to try my hand at podcasting. The first episode drops next week on June 7th. And when creating this, when coming up with the concept, the team that I worked with helped me come to the realization that assumptions really are such a through line for everything that I talk about in my work, which all centers around communication, in my writing, which all centers around communication. Assumptions really are the through line. So the podcast is just me talking. It's what they call a commuter podcast. The episodes are 15 minutes each, just me. I'm not interviewing anyone, at least not for this season. We'll see how it goes. But they're just me taking a look at some different aspect of the way that assumptions show up and examples of how I've gotten it wrong in my own life and offering some solutions. What do we do with this? What are some ways around it? How can we all do a little bit better moving forward? All boils down to awareness. The more that we're willing to be aware of what's happening and what we can do about it, the more we're in a position to actually take action. So that's what the podcast is about.
I'm excited for it because I love your blunt communication style. And I also agree. I don't think I don't know how anyone can argue that assumptions are at the root, because it seems like obviously that's at the root of it. So I'd be curious. So you'll have to report back if someone finds some way to say that that's not the case. But I can't imagine it. That'll be a good person for a podcast guest.
Right.
Well, I am so happy that we are here because, as you said before, you were in our Getting Started for Authors writing program, working on it. So we had all real time, all the things, and then obviously worked through the whole publishing process together. So to me, it's always like a little bit extra special when we're like there for like the birth of it, like the full birth of it, to actually being in the hands of people. So I'm very excited. And I personally can't wait to dive into it. But as I said, I'm gonna hold for a smidge. But yeah, so if anyone is watching this, your book is still available to purchase directly through you at your website? Yes.
Yes, books can be found on my website, which is patnaudecoaching.com. They also can be found on any website that sells books, bookshop.org, Amazon. They're all over the interwebs, so looking for them. But if you want a signed copy, come through my website.
Yes, I will say signed copies to me are always better. Like mine is a signed copy. I'm very happy about that. All of my whole bookshelf is signed copies. It's like the best part of this process, in my opinion, is all the ups and downs, the crying, the moments of stress. It's like you're holding a signed copy at the end, though. Like there's something physical and tangible. And so that's why I love doing what I do. And so thank you for that. But it's just better for you as an author when we support the author directly rather than going through some of these bigger platforms that are, billion-dollar entities where you could support the author directly. So I encourage you to go to patnaudecoaching.com and get your book there. And then go to Amazon and leave a review. That would be my next call to action. So please, reviews really do make a huge difference in terms of the visibility for authors' work. So if you can take the couple of minutes to do that, it would be incredibly appreciated by all of us. Ellen, any final things before we wrap up?
No, just to say thank you for doing this. I It has been a privilege to work with Publish Your Purpose through this process. You really have been here from conception through birth of this book, and it's just delightful to continue working with you. So thank you for everything that you do, Jen.
You are very welcome. I appreciate you as well. And thank you for this conversation. I will be back at a later date talking to somebody else, but today go support Ellen, and we'll see you all.